Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal and political correspondent. And today we have a very distinguished guest with us, former Congressman David Obey from Wausau. David, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
And I may fall into congressman, but emphasize the former. You were in Congress for over 40 years, having first been elected when you were 30 years old, is that right?
I was 12.
Yeah. Well, you were in the Assembly before you were in Congress, is that right?
Yeah, I served 6 years in the Assembly before I went to Congress.
Okay. And what must have been through, doing my math, about 20 terms then in Congress?
Well, what is it? It's 21 terms.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to ask you at some point your opinion on term limits then, given that. But I want to get into what you're here for. And maybe some of the folks aren't as familiar with you. They are going to get more familiar with the office you held, which is 7th District Congressman, because now St. Croix County is in the 7th CD, or will be after this next election. And or is it with this election in 2010?
No, it's this coming election.
Yeah. Okay, 2012 election, it applies. And it's because of the census, that's every 10 years. So let's start with that. I know what brought you to town here is the recall petition drive right now for Governor Scott Walker. And I want you to be able to talk about that a little bit, but as well as talking about this redistricting. And have you ever seen anything like that in the time that you were in Congress?
Well, I've never seen anything in this state like what Governor Walker has done since January. I mean, when I was in the legislature back in the Precambrian era when dinosaurs were still roaming the land, Warren Knowles was governor. He was a good, moderate, decent Republican. His brother, Bob Knowles, was the power in the state Senate. And we got along fine. I mean, we would debate and argue strongly between 9 and 5. And then after 5 o'clock, we'd get together and socialize, and we were friends. My best friend in the legislature was Bill Steiger, a Republican from Oshkosh. Today, it's changed. It's become a snake pit. And the governor, I think, is largely responsible for the tone that's set in Madison and the 4 problems that I see with him.
Well, and before we get to those 4 problems, I think you've hit on a big point, and that is tone, because it's not just the tone here in Wisconsin, but also in Washington. And I want to point out, I did a little research before we came, although I had my political science training, and you were in office when I was getting that training at Carthage College and UW-Madison, your alma mater. But they said about you on Conservapedia that you were a liberal Democrat from Wisconsin, chairman of the powerful House Appropriations Committee, which handles most of the spending of the federal government. And Obey has a reputation for working well with his Republican colleagues, but having a prickly personality. So how is it that even your opponents can consider you somebody that works well with the opposition, and yet have what's be known for a prickly personality? How does that work, that 9 to 5 thing, turning it on and turning it off?
Well, I mean, your political opponents don't have to be your enemies. I mean, that's the difference. When Newt Gingrich came to town in 1978, he started literally running courses teaching people how to use language that would tear down your political opponent, not just his political positions, but his personhood. And Washington has been going downhill ever since. So there's nothing inconsistent with having strongly held views and still being able to work with the other side. I mean, the whole idea in politics is that the political parties need to first define their differences so that the public knows what they're getting if they elect either one of them. But after they've defined their differences, they also need to be able to resolve them. And that's, the parties have been very good at defining their differences lately and not very good at resolving them.
Well, and there was a period there where you went back and forth between being the chair of the House Appropriations Committee and then being the ranking Democrat, because the Republicans took control of Congress twice while you were there.
Yeah, and that's all right. I mean, that's the way the system is supposed to work. The people who get the most votes are supposed to win.
Okay, so let's now with that last point that you make. It's a great segue. When elections matter, when people who get the votes. So why is it that Governor Walker should be recalled. If he got the votes, why shouldn't he be allowed to serve out his term?
Or ordinarily, I would say that I don't like the process of recall either. But when somebody abuses power to the extent that they have, and when they mislead the public to the extent they have, then you have no recourse. And if you look at what has happened, the governor went to the people of Wisconsin and said he had to gut education budgets because he didn't have the money to deal with education needs. I checked with the Legislative Fiscal Bureau and I asked them, what has happened to income tax rates in this state since the day that I left the legislature to go to Congress? And
so that means going back to 1969.
1969, when Warren Knowles was governor, a good, responsible, middle-of-the-road Republican. And what the Fiscal Bureau said was that in that time, the lower tax bracket, the tax rate for people in the lower bracket has increased by 70%. The tax rate for people in the highest bracket, people who make over 210 grand a year, has gone down by 22%. If the governor had simply returned that top bracket for people who make over 210 grand a year to the same level that it was when Warren Knowles was governor, we would have raised $600 million more in the biennium, and he could have reduced by 2/3 the hit that he laid on education. But the governor wanted to go after education. He wanted to cut the budget, and he also wanted to gut teachers' ability to have anything at all to say about what happened to them at the bargaining table. And so he used the budget as a flimsy excuse to gut their right to even have a say about their future.
Isn't this just promoting the general philosophy of Republicans for smaller government and trying to reduce the size of government?
If you're going to do that, then you ought to tell the public you're going to do it before the election, and you shouldn't pretend that you're doing it for budgetary reasons. I mean, the governor has admitted that he did it for political reasons. He wanted to gut the ability of anybody who disagreed with him to be effective in politics. So that's what. And then what he's done.
I know what you're alluding to, but are you alluding to the public bargaining and trying to break down the teacher union?
Absolutely.
And how would that stifle his opposition then?
Well, they are opposed to his cutting education. He doesn't want to have to brook any opposition, and so what he has simply done is to gut the ability of the unions to even represent them at the bargaining table in a meaningful way. If the unions representative at the bargaining table is going to have nothing to say about wages, nothing to say about benefits, nothing to say about working conditions, why have a union? That's what he wants to drive home, because he wants to bust the union now and forever.
Well, isn't this just kind of, like I said, a continuation of the Republican philosophy? Tommy Thompson, wouldn't have he done this eventually?
Tommy Thompson would never have done this. I mean, Tommy Thompson was a moderate Republican, and I would be astounded if Tommy was happy with what the governor did.
Okay. Now you were getting to your reasons, so I think we've touched two of them.
Those are the two substantive problems. But then what they have done, what Governor Walker and the legislature did, was to then try to put the politicians beyond the reach of anybody in the public who wanted to retaliate if they didn't like what they did. And so first of all,
at the ballot box you're talking about.
Yes. So first of all, they passed a new redistricting bill, which simply turned a lot of marginal districts into the state into safe Republican districts. Example, the Roberta Darling seat in Milwaukee. She was one of them who was in a recall contest. But the Republicans were not willing to take no for an answer. They wanted to make sure that even if she lost that election,
the recall election,
that in November she would be guaranteed to win that seat back, because they stripped all the Democrats out of her district. If you take a look at what they did on the congressional level.
Well, let's look first. We've got two maps that have been scanned in and our viewers can see. Let's show them first the map of what it was before Governor Walker took office.
Right. And if you take a look at the 3rd district, you see that the lines roughly follow county lines. This line jiggles because Adams County, the border for the county, follows the river. But this district, as you can see, is compact. The lines are straight. Local county lines are respected. Municipal lines are respected. Now, if you turn to the other,
And just pointing out, this was the size of your district before you left office, was the 7th.
That's right.
And went over to Wausau, all the way over to the Minnesota border and up to
that's right,
Superior.
and up to Superior.
And Ron Kyne's district, which St. Croix County used to be in, was here. And I remember a time before the last one in 2000 where the 3rd CD even went up further to the north.
Well, the 3rd district has always been a Mississippi River district, and the 7th district has always been a Wisconsin River Valley district. In fact, Marathon, Wood, and Portage and Lincoln counties have been in the same congressional district for 90 years until the Republicans blew that up with their district.
Okay, now you're referring to the new map. What are you referring to specifically about the 3rd CD being a Mississippi River district?
Well, what they've done now is they've snaked this district all the way up to the Marathon County line. They've snaked the 3rd district, Ron Kyne's district, up there, for the purpose of carving Portage County and eastern Wood County, which contains Wisconsin Rapids. They wanted to carve those out of the 7th district because they were heavily Democratic areas, and they wanted to tilt the balance in favor of Sean Duffy, the Republican congressman in that district.
In your old district.
Right. And then what they did in Chippewa County, because the candidate against Duffy is going to be Pat Kreidel, a former state senator from Chippewa.
And that's over here, Chippewa.
Right. Yes. What they've done is they carefully stripped the city of Chippewa Falls and the southern Chippewa County townships out of the 7th district, but they drew the line carefully so that they kept Kreidlow's house in the district, so that when they were asked when Congressman Ryan, who drew this plan, was asked why they did that, weren't they being unfair to Kreidlow? He said, "Oh, no, we left Kreidlow's house in the district. They didn't want to be obvious about what they were doing, but they tried to, in effect, electorally run away from Kreidlow by carving
So just
Chippewa
his
out of the
house, but
district.
then the constituency that he has in the city of Chippewa Falls would...
They dumped that into the 3rd.
Okay.
And then what they did was to move St. Croix County out of the 3rd. They've been in the 3rd district for a long time. They moved St. Croix County into the 7th district in order to balance off the votes that they had to add because they took Wood and Portage out of the district.
And by votes, balanced votes, you're just sheer numbers, so that the population would be roughly the same. But the demographics, you would agree, for Stevens Point and St. Croix County are quite different as far as Republican and Democrat.
Under the law, under the Constitution, every 10 years, you're supposed to rebalance the districts so that they are equal in population. That's the goal of redistricting. In order to equalize the population between the 7th and the 3rd, all they would have had to do is to move about 20,000 people, 25,000 people from one district to another. Instead, they wound up moving over 200,000 people from one district to another. So they disrupt people's voting habits, they destroy continuity. And Lee Dreyfus used to refer to the Marathon Portage Wood area as ruralplex, and he used to say that for economic development purposes, you should treat that as one unit. So much for Lee Dreyfus's view. The Republicans have decided that they were going to ignore that advice, and so they've now made the 3rd district a Wisconsin River district as well as a Mississippi River district.
So what we had was, the goal was to move about 20,000 votes on this map, and that could have been done by anywhere along here. And the 7th needed to gain 20,000 votes, so that could have been done in this Clark County in some way.
Sure.
And instead, they did switch Clark County, but then they went even further and then started adding things to the 3rd CD. So looking at those, it's not very respectful of the county lines and continuity of interest? Is
It
that
is it's a blatantly political approach to redistricting. And I was proud of the fact that in the 4 previous cycles, I worked with Jim Sensenbrenner, a Republican, and before that with Bill Steiger, a Republican, to see to it that these district lines were drawn in a fair way for both parties. And I think what this demonstrates is that so long as you have divided government, it's probably all right to let the parties have at it because they'll balance each other out and you'll wind up with probably a fair result. But when you have one party control, that's when the funny business begins. And so it seems to me that if you have one party control, then these lines ought to be drawn by a citizens commission so that you keep the results politically honest.
Well, there's basically no opposition then to go from here to here if you control legislature and the governor's mansion.
Well, that's right.
And in this case, you had said you've got some experience in this redistricting, having been through elections going back to the 60s. So most of your redistricting would look more like what the old map did. Did you ever have a situation like this?
Certainly not in the time that I've been around.
Okay.
But then the fourth thing that the governor did was, and I think this is the most serious thing that the governor did, they passed what they call the voter ID law. They claim that it was in order to try to prevent fraud at the ballot box. I think the governor has engaged in far more fraud in selling that bill than you have ever seen exhibited at the ballot box by anybody else in this state. What they've done is by their new requirements, they are going to make it much more difficult for seniors, for college students, and for poor people to actually be able to cast a vote because they require new pieces of identification. And that's going to discourage a lot of senior citizens from going to the polls. A lot of seniors don't have driver's licenses. College students, they move around, and if they can't use their residency card from the university as proof, a lot of them are going to say, "To heck with it, we're not going to vote." And what bothers me about that is that this is clearly part of a national effort on the part of the far right portion of the Republican Party. It's been estimated that nationally this will result in about 5 million fewer people voting in the next election. And it upsets me because, in my view, when you start going after somebody's basic right to vote, you are going at the guts of democracy. And to me, that should not just be recallable, it should be impeachable.
There has been a lot of reference when the protests were going down in the Capitol to the governor's attempt to have that in the budget bill and then he eventually backed off and stripped it from the budget bill and allowed that collective bargaining changes to pass, citing the protesters that were mostly, it was out-of-staters. This is not Wisconsin people that were against it. It's people either being paid or jobless folks that are just promised a free meal to come to Wisconsin and sit in the Capitol.
In plain, unvarnished farm language, that's bull gravy.
Okay.
I was in that crowd for 3 days. I've never seen such a well-behaved crowd in my life. And I saw constituents of mine from Spooner, from Superior, from Ashland, from Hurley, or Wisconsin Rapids. I didn't know they were out-of-staters. But the governor seems to try to be convincing people of that. That's absolute nonsense. You had 100,000 people gather on the Capitol lawn because people were angry and they decided they were mad as hell and they weren't going to take it anymore. And I was proud of not only that they showed up and voiced their views, but they did it in a civil way. I've never seen such a well-behaved.
Well, they had cameras of folks who were sneaking in behind the guards and knocking in boarded windows and to go through and get back into the Capitol once they weren't allowed to return. Now, are you saying that didn't happen, or is it just not?
I'm saying there was virtually no bad behavior. You are always going to have some idiot in a crowd who gets out of line. But the fact is, that crowd was very well managed. You had people from the police union working on their own time to see to it that things didn't get out of hand. And I was there, and I walked around that Capitol for 3 days, and I saw what was going on. And the governor was far more abusive of the democratic process than that crowd was.
Well, these allegations of outer states, you're not denying that some of the folks in the crowd, if they were asked if they were from Ohio or Pennsylvania or Iowa, may have been from those states?
I am sure that there were probably a handful, but the fact is that that 95% of that crowd were Badgers, and they were fed up with what was happening. And they were the husbands of teachers, they were policemen, they were firemen. And I mean, I defy the governor to show that this was not a homegrown effort to strike back at what he was trying to do to disenfranchise them.
Well, while we're on the subject of homegrown and outside influences or outside the state influences, what do you see as the influence of money in the elections? Ron Kind, at the very end, about a week, 10 days before the election, saw large sums of money being dumped into that race from organizations that have names like, for Democracy for America.
Citizens Council for the Preservation of Sweetness and Light, and all of that nonsense. I mean, the sad fact is that the U.S. Supreme Court has ruined politics in this country because they have equated money with speech, and with their most recent court decisions, they guarantee that virtually any corporation in this country can spend whatever they want to spend in an election, and they can do it anonymously.
Now the Supreme Court decision didn't happen that long ago. I mean, it's within the last 2 years, but yet in the last election cycles and in these recall elections, we saw some of that influencing elections
We've
already.
had a steady stream of court decisions going back to 1959 that have inexorably allowed money to play a far bigger role in politics than they should have. And to me, it's the worst failure of our system, because now the people with money can pour money into any campaign, and they can do it anonymously. And you've already seen evidence of it all over the country.
All right. Now, have we touched on the recall of Governor Walker and the 4 reasons sufficiently? I wanted to be able to respect, because that's what brings you here to Hudson area. What about?
Well, and I did want to welcome the folks in St. Croix County to the 7th District.
All right.
I mean, they're going to be in the 7th District for 10 years, it appears, unless the court overturns what the legislature did. And so I think that it's good for them to get to know as much as possible about what's going on in their new congressional district.
Now, while you may not be happy with the way it was drawn, that's the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be for the next 10 years.
Sure.
And you're still going to be able to find some continuity of interest throughout 7th District. St. Croix County is not that much different from Marathon County?
No, but well, actually, they are very different. I mean, the thing about the 7th District, it is such a huge district that there are many different kinds of communities in the district. Superior is very different from Stevens Point. Hurley is very different from Hudson. I mean, there is not necessarily a community of interest between St. Croix County and Marathon County. St. Croix County has much more in common with the Wisconsin River country, but that's what the district looks like, and so...
in the end, though, we all just want to be able to work hard and play by the rules, and isn't that the way that you've basically governed then when you were in there for 40 years? I want to get back to that a little bit, because we had touched on tone and abuses of power, and allegations go back and forth, but you don't get a reputation for having been able to work well with the other party like you had when you were there without having some truth behind that. And why is it that when you were the ranking Democrat on House Appropriations Committee, that we were able to balance a budget when President Clinton was president, and they were able to come to some agreement. There wasn't even any talk of needing a balanced budget then. Now there's talk about, well, it's obvious Congress can't get it done, so we need to invoke a balanced budget. What would you have to say to that?
Well, what I would say is that the last thing I will do is to tolerate any Republican member of the Congress giving me a lecture on deficits, not after their record since the days of Ronald Reagan. Before Ronald Reagan came to power and before the Congress passed his budget, we never had a deficit larger than $70 billion, and that occurred under Jerry Ford. And that was not Ford's fault. It was because of the energy crisis, which dumped the country into a big recession. Reagan wound up producing huge deficits. So when George Bush Sr. became president, he sat down with the Democrats and they began the process of bringing that deficit down by actions that were taken under George Bush Sr.'s term. Then Bill Clinton came in, and the actions that he took finished the job. We didn't get a single vote from the Republicans in the House or the Senate for the Clinton budget that led to 4 balanced budgets in a row. So we had to do that all on the Democratic side, and they pounded the devil out of us in the next election because of it. And in fact, we lost control of the House because of reaction to that. But we did what was necessary to bring the budget into balance. Then what happened is when and we had 4 budget surpluses in a row. George Bush came to power. He passed 2 tax cuts primarily aimed at high-income people, primarily benefiting high-income people making over $200,000 a year. He also got us involved in 2 wars, which I tried to see would at least be paid for. I mean, name me one other time in our country's history when the president came to the country and said, folks, we've got a serious problem. We got a war going on. I've got to cut your taxes. I mean, that's irresponsible. If you're going to fight a war, you need to pay for it so that you don't have inflation exploding and ruining the economy.
Well, we didn't get inflation, but we did get big deficits.
Sure did.
And when on the heels of the big tax cuts early in the Bush terms, then of course we had the 2 wars were started and Medicare Part D was initiated with, again,
and
no
that
reason
was not paid for either.
Right.
So that's what put us in the hole. And so now, if you're gonna get out of the hole, you have to remember how you got in. And the first thing you have to do is to dedicate the money that has been going to the wars. You've got to dedicate that to deficit reduction, and you also have to return the tax code for the higher brackets to the level that it was at under Bill Clinton. That didn't exactly hurt the economy of the country. The country was doing pretty well in those days. Well,
why can't we get, you cited, the history leading up to where we're at, but we have had no consensus, no ability for the 2 parties to work together. And we had this deadline of Thanksgiving for which they were supposed to have a deficit reduction plan, which was not for this budget year at all. It was for 2013 and beyond. And they couldn't come to an agreement. Why is it that we have to get beyond the 11th hour before anything gets done, and even then it's not adequate?
Because decisions are made by human beings, and you need to understand what motivates those human beings. And in the case of Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate leader, it is clear to me that he is deadly intent on preventing Obama from winning anything at all. And he has tried to obstruct virtually everything that Obama has tried to do. And because the Senate is one of the most screwed up institutions in the world with their filibuster rules, it means that the minority in the Senate runs the show. In a normal legislative body, if you get 51% of the votes, you win. In the United States Senate, you don't. If you get 51% of the votes, you lose, because under their filibuster breaking rules, you have to get 60% of the votes to win. So McConnell sits as minority leader. He admits blatantly to the press that his #1 goal is to deny Obama a second term, and so he is hell-bent on seeing to it that nothing good happens.
Well, do you think it's a matter of changing the goals? Maybe if the goal were to have deficit reduction or to
doesn't matter what the goal is. Mitch McConnell has been against it.
okay.
I mean, I really believe what's happened in this country is that I think we've had a generational change that has not been good for the country. I mean, before, if you take a look at the World War II generation, people like Bob Dole, after you've gone through a war and been shot at and been wounded and doggone near died, and then after you've also gone through the Great Depression, you don't get very worried about taking some minor league political risks in order to do something that needs to be done. And that World War II generation had a strong sense of duty to the whole, as opposed to the individual little single issue groups in society. But now that generation is all gone, and I think the leadership that you've got now coming out of the baby boomer generation and the generation past it, I think they have much less dedication to the needs of the whole. Now, my great hope is that the younger generation, those under 30, voters under 30 in this society, if you look at the polls, they take a much more communitarian approach to issues. They're used to problem solving as teams, not as one-man bands. And it's my hope that as that generation begins to vote in larger numbers, that they will demand a different kind of performance from their politicians.
How do you turn it around, though, with the influence of lobbying and so forth? And emails go back and forth. Now in this age of email, they didn't have that when you first started. And now instant communication, the 24/7 news cycle, you have emails going around, and I've seen them, where they blame Congress. They say Congress gets pensions of $400,000 a year for life. By the way, I didn't know you made that much money.
And neither did I.
And they blame Congress. You know, you do see the poll numbers saying 9% approval rating, and they say the problem is term limits. And you're the poster child for that, because you were in there for 40 years. We need to have term limits, and therefore that's going to turn the whole thing around.
Well, I mean, why should you blame people for blaming Congress when you see what the results have been?
So you wouldn't be, you're not surprised by the 9% approval rating.
When the Tea Party people first started raising cane, and when the the occupiers started their actions a couple of months ago, my reaction was, what in God's name took you so long? Because what you've had government for the past 30 years follow economic policies that have resulted in the largest transfer of income up the income scale in the history of the universe. And as a result, if you're in that top 1%, you are going like gangbusters. Virtually all of the income growth in this society for George Bush's last 6 years as president, virtually all of the income growth went to the top 10% of the people, and everybody else got table scraps.
But that's even followed under Obama. In the last 3 years that he's been president, I mean, the reduction in wages for real wages for blue collars has gone down.
Sure, because of the recession, which he inherited. When he inherited the recession, we were losing 600,000 jobs a month. We're now gaining about 120,000 jobs a month. That's not enough, but I'm amazed we're gaining jobs at all, given what's happening in Europe, because the Europe market is collapsing, and that's going to make it very difficult for us to export our goods.
Well, and because of the political decisions that are being made in this country, we're dropping public sector jobs daily, and the private sector isn't quite able to keep up, although the unemployment went down to 8.6.
Well,
do you see it getting under 8? Historically, they say a president can't be reelected if it's over 6, and are we going to be able to get that done here if it's over 8?
I think, the election, who wins the election isn't as important as what's happening to people in their own lives. And the problem that you have is that the policies that are being followed are not going to be able to overcome what's happening in the world economy. And when you have the Republicans last week said, "Oh yeah, let's take care of the payroll tax." And how did they want to do it? They introduced a jobs bill, which would have required that we cut 200,000 more jobs from the federal government. The federal government has already lost jobs every year since 2008. We're now down to the lowest number of federal employees we've had since 2008. And every time you cut a job, whether it's public or private, that weakens the economy. The problem we've got, I mean, the deficit is an important issue long term, but the most important issue right now is to deal with the unemployment problem. And that means you
Well,
should
why
not
wouldn't that be cutting taxes more? Because that's the answer from the Republican side is you cut taxes, you
No, that's
help
not
the job
That's
creators.
not the answer from the that's what the Republicans said until Obama said, "All right, let's do it," and then the Republicans flipped and said no. I mean, Obama is trying to not only extend the payroll tax exemption, he's trying to enlarge it as well. So he wants that to be a bigger exemption than we had earlier because that gives the economy a bigger kick. And the Republicans have been foot dragging for the last 3 weeks on it. And why they do it is beyond me, except that I've been around long. I haven't just fallen off the turnip truck. And I know Mitch McConnell's moves, and I can tell an obstructionist when I see one because I've had to deal with them all of my life.
So you're saying the only hope is to wait till after November 5th of next year and
No, I'm saying that the public needs to cut through the propaganda and insist that people put first things first. And therein lies a big problem. Because with what has happened to news in this country, newspapers are in big trouble because of the internet. They're collapsing and they're going out of business right and left. But then if you take a look at what's happening with TV news,
nobody trusts the media anymore.
well, the problem is that there isn't a media. There are all kinds of little fragments of media. So today, I mean, it used to be when I started in politics that the entire country got the news from 3 networks. So they had a common experience. They all saw the same things that were happening and being reported. Today, what happens is you got 24-hour news. So you've got to fill that airtime with something. And so part of the time it's solid stuff and part of the time it's garbage. And the problem is also that the press has changed so much so that today if you're a conservative, you watch Fox. If you're a liberal, you watch MSNBC. If you don't know what you are, you watch CNN. And people watch the TV news channels that tend to reinforce their own biases, and they don't spend a lot of time listening to the arguments from the other side, and that makes it very much more difficult for any political leaders to get people to compromise, because what I always say is the problem with our system is that I don't care if you're talking about liberal, conservative, or moderate. Today, you take 10 like-minded people, you put them in a room for an hour, they have a discussion, they walk out, and they think they've conducted a public opinion poll, when in fact, they don't understand that there are lots of other people with lots of different views and lots of good reasons for having those views. But I mean, the country is divided 6 different ways in terms of these issues. And the politicians, some of them try to deal with it, and some of them try to take advantage of it for their own gain.
And back to the people. Congress is supposed to be representing the people, and your solution then is the people need to control this. And some of it is from the Tea Party movement, some of it's from the occupiers, but you need to get more. But I would say for the vast majority of the electorate, they seem to be getting turned off. And until Obama's election, number of votes had been going down, and people have been turned off by Congress and politics and partisanship.
Well, they should be turned off by the product for the past 30 years. But the problem you've got is that, well, I guess the best way to put it is to simply say that in primaries, you tend to have the most liberal voters vote in the Democratic Party and the most conservative Republicans vote in the Republican Party. And a lot of the moderates in both parties and a lot of the independents don't vote in primaries. So as a result, what do you get?
Extreme candidates.
Yeah. And so so
I saw a demographic.
Therein lies the rise of Newt Gingrich again. I mean, if the Iowa caucus voters looked anything like the national Republican voters of 10 or 15 years ago, Newt Gingrich would be laughed out of the room.
Well, I saw a graphic on one of the stations that was having discussions with experienced politicians, and they talked about the loss of bipartisanship or tripartisanship, and they looked at the makeup of Congress, what was being elected in the 60s. When Proxmire was our senator, they showed the body and showed the red, the congressmen who were far to the right, and the left, and the majority were still in the gray area, in the middle. And now you take a picture of what the Senate looks like now, and there's no gray left.
But the fact is, both parties have moved to the right the last 30 years. They both moved to the right. You have at the congressional level,
Okay.
not at the presidential level. But you cannot expect people to feel good about government when they see somebody in their family losing a job, when they see their neighbor losing their job, when they see housing. I get very angry listening to people like Gingrich, who will tell people that the answer to our housing problem is to let Wall Street loose, take off all of this terrible regulation on Wall Street. That's how we got into this problem. Over the past 20 years, presidents and the Congress allowed banks to begin behaving like casinos.
I saw in some of your votes, and we need to wrap it up, but I saw one of your votes was you were against reducing regulation on the subprime mortgages. You wanted to see more regulation. That was a 2007 vote. And then we saw what happened. How did that?
Well,
Is it the influence of money on the Hill?
It's ideology and it's the influence of money on the Hill. I mean, the fact is that this economy almost crashed. I mean, it's had a bad enough time the last 5 years, but it almost totally crashed like we did in the 30s because the Congress allowed banks to begin to behave like casinos. They blew away Glass-Steagall. There was a reason the Congress in the 30s prevented community banks from becoming investment bankers, because they didn't want people to be playing Russian roulette and rolling the dice with the average family money. Okay. And that was changed. And so all of a sudden, Wall Street was able to do any blessed thing they wanted to do without significant oversight, and we paid a terrible price for it. I mean, you don't need to have government looking over the shoulder at every banker who does anything, but you do have to have a government that is strong enough to prevent people from running away with other people's money. I mean, we see. After we saw that happen once with the savings and loan associations, with their scandal in the 80s, primarily because of inadequate state regulation in states like Texas and California. You didn't have a similar problem in Wisconsin because Wisconsin had responsible regulation, and that produced responsible conduct by most of our savings and loans in the state. But even after that national scandal, they went right in and they drank the Kool-Aid and bought the baloney and gave Wall Street more ability to do whatever they damn well please. And as a result, the average investor and the average consumer took it in the chops.
So are you saying that government's then the answer to be able to turn it around, or back to the people again?
Well, with all due respect, the average guy who goes to work in a paper mill doesn't have any ability to control what's going on in Wall Street. He needs a government to be on his side to make doggone sure that these institutions are not behaving in a way which is going to put somebody else's prosperity at risk. I mean, Abe Lincoln made the point that government has to be strong enough to do what the people can't do themselves. That ought to be the test. What's the main threat? And the main threat, in my view, to this economy has been the irresponsible actions of Wall Street and some of your investment bankers who played Russian roulette with other people's money, and they lost the farm.
Well, I think we'll end it there with a quote from a Republican president, from a distinguished Democratic congressman. Dave Obey, thanks a lot for being with us, and hope we can have you back sometime and continue this discussion, and hopefully things turn around. We'll see. It'll get interesting come next November.
It sure will.
Thank you again.
You bet.
And thank you for joining us here on Western Wisconsin Journal.